Welcome, everyone, to the 85th episode of the Clements Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, and I'm director of the Clements of the Director of Development at the Clements Library and your host this morning. Today's meeting is being recorded to share online, and this afternoon you will receive an email with the recording and any resources that are mentioned during today's broadcast. In case you're joining us for the first time, we do encourage people to use the chat. You're welcome to chime in. Just change the settings to everyone. My colleagues Anne and Katie are monitoring the chat and answering questions and pasting in good information. However, if you have questions for today's panelists, please put those in the Q&A section. That will keep them all together. In addition, everyone can see the questions that are in there, and you're welcome to give it a thumbs up to help reorder the questions if someone asks something that you're also particularly interested in. We have the live machine captions turned on today, so you can toggle those on or off or change the size. And I can only control so much of what you see. So hopefully you're able to move the relative size of the slides and the speakers. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library. We're located on the University of Michigan Central Campus in Ann Arbor. And the Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of the history and culture of North America and the Caribbean up to the beginning of the 20th century. I also want to mention, especially as we celebrate Native American Heritage Month, that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library also acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. Okay, so speaking of Native American Heritage Month, if you haven't yet done the poll question, click very quickly and I will end it and share the results. Okay, so people made great guesses, thinking that it was relatively recently that it became a recognized month. And so 1990 is the correct answer. President George H.W. Bush signed legislation establishing Native American Heritage Month in 1990. And then in 1991, Congress passed a resolution ensuring that the observance would be recognized annually. So thank you, everybody, for participating in that poll. We want to let you know that each year the Multi-Ethnic Student Affairs Department and the Native American Student Association at the University of Michigan collaborate with campus partners to bring a wide range of events that celebrate Native American culture. And you can take a look at the website. Most of it's done already for this month, but perhaps you'll keep it in your mind for the future. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's guests, who have both been visiting research fellows at the Clements Library. Ben Pokross is a literary historian specializing in 19th century American literature, Native American and Indigenous literature, and media studies. He is currently a visiting assistant professor of English at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. His book project, Writing History in the 19th Century Great Lakes, examines historical writing as it developed between settler and Native communities in the 19th century. He received his PhD in English from Yale University in 2023. And Emily Dixon-Magness, Cherokee Nation and Shawnee Tribe, is a PhD candidate in history at William and Mary, where she studies gender, war, and politics during the Anglo-Cherokee War. Emily is currently working on her dissertation titled, If You'd Paid Attention, You Would Know, Gender, Politics, and Power in the Anglo-Cherokee War, to understand how Cherokee women's political priorities with Indigenous and imperial polities shaped war and peace in 18th century Cherokee country. Thank you both so much for being here and welcome. All right, I am going to stop my sharing and turn it over to Ben.
All right, thanks, Angela. Let me share my screen. Um, okay, can everybody see the PowerPoint? Okay, great. Um, all right, so thanks, Angela, for that introduction. And I want to thank Anne, Maggie, Paul, Isaac, and everybody at the Clements for giving me the chance to present my work here and for being so welcoming in Ann Arbor, which has been a truly transformative period for my research. So today I want to discuss my book project, Writing History in the 19th Century Great Lakes. This work comes out of my dissertation, which I defended in 2023 and is still very much a work in progress. So I'm delighted to hear everyone's thoughts and reactions in the Q&A. So my plan for this talk is to introduce the project and then highlight two examples drawn from the Clements collections that illustrate my arguments and have really helped to push my ideas in new directions. So then I'll wrap up by coming back, I think, to some of the larger questions of the project. Um, Okay, let's dive in. So, at the second annual meeting of the Michigan Historical Society in 1830, the notorious ethnologist and Indian agent Henry Rose Schoolcraft declared that the institution's work should focus on recording the history of the region's native people. Other societies are favorably located to preserve the materials of our national history, he says, at least as it's recorded in the published version of the talk, and you can see the title page of that on the screen. It is our province to glean upon the frontiers, to take the Great Lakes and its inhabitants as the subject of their historical labor. Schoolcraft's language is ugly, his intent explicitly extractive. But I think if we stay here for 1 second, we might think about what this practice might look like. Schoolcraft's address lingers uneasily on methodological issues, weighing the importance of oral traditions against, quote, written or monumental history, and comes to redefine history itself with respect to Native people. History can be applied only to what is known of the Indian tribes, he asserts, within a comparatively recent era. Schoolcraft speaks to the pervasive sense of opportunity and anxiety about writing Native history in the middle of the 19th century. But it was not only white settlers and their institutions that were invested in writing Native history or refusing it. Writing history in the 19th century Great Lakes shows that Native authors not only penned histories themselves, but played a constitutive role in the creation of new forms of representing the past. By analyzing five emergent genres of historical writing in the 19th century, the legend, the traditional history, the textual memorial, the rural sketch, and the souvenir, I argue that we can see the influence Native people have always had in crafting their own histories. The native past takes on particular force in the Great Lakes, where indigenous people could not easily be dismissed as vanishing. The Anishinaabe, who had lived there for generations, had been enmeshed in colonial economic networks since the 17th century, networks that persisted throughout the 1800s. In this region of active entanglement between white settlers and native people, history was a key site of struggle. This project tracks the contours of these debates over the form and genre that the history of Indigenous people should take. As historical writing professionalized with increasingly strict document based evidentiary practices, my project details the contentious thinking about history occurring at its margins. Out of these arguments arose new ways of writing about the past, whether on thin sheets of newsprint or through seemingly ephemeral souvenirs. Writing history in the 19th century Great Lakes changes what we think history looks like, revealing the media experiment of Native people as they found new ways to document the past. So I want to linger a little bit on with each of the genres that I trace because I think this methodological emphasis on genre is sort of quite fundamental to my project. So I begin with the quote sort of Indian legend, as it became a key genre for a debate in the 1820s and 30s over what constitutes the history of Indigenous people. When we examine, for example, the place of story within the corpus of Henry Rowe Schoolcraft and his Métis Ojibwe wife, Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, we see them sometimes referred to these stories as allegories, tales, legends, or traditions. These stories' generic instability, at least in English, shows how the distinction between history and myth was not clear. I then follow how these stories were rewritten throughout the antebellum period, revealing how the legend becomes a way of condemning Native people to the past, as well as a genre that could insist on the continued vitality of Native lifeways. And you can see here several reprintings of these stories from Jane Johnston's Schoolcraft's family that were sort of written and collected by her husband, and sort of the changes in the presentation. So I then turn to the development of the traditional history through the work of mid-century Anishinaabe historians George Copway, Peter Jones, William Whipple Warren, and Francis Asikenak. These texts foreground their reliance on the oral tradition. That's what makes them a quote sort of traditional history. But what did it mean to invoke the oral tradition in print? As information about Native people circulated ever more widely in travel narratives, ethnological studies, and government reports, thinking about the oral tradition becomes a means of considering the transmission of knowledge about indigeneity. Asikinak's emphasis on the haziness of his family's stories, for example, counterintuitively becomes a way of asserting his authority in describing Anishinaabe history. By emphasizing the diversity of approaches these writers take when invoking stories and traditions, I suggest that writing about the oral tradition allowed these writers to reflect on their relationship to antebellum media culture. Thinking about these two genres together, I think, shows us how Native people, long before oral history methodologies developed in Western historiography, were bringing together documentary history with the oral tradition. So, the textual memorial is perhaps the least obvious of my genres. It refers to a genre less defined by a specific format or medium than an ambition to preserve the entirety of Native America. These textual memorials, as I call them, are formal experiments in historical writing that come to reflect on the very terms that made preservation possible in mid-century America. Tracking the textual productions of writers who successfully engage in the antebellum public sphere, like Mississauga Ojibwe performer George Henry and historian George Copway, reveals their belief that they could adapt emerging mass media to ensure Native survivance. The concept of the textual memorial helps us to understand an object like Copway's American Indian, a newspaper published briefly by Copway in 1851. As editor of the paper, Copway brings together excerpts from his own writing with reprinted articles that express a broad range of views about Indigenous people. In this role, I see Copway as a media theorist, using the newspaper to expose how media representations abstracted Native people in the process of memorializing them, and then putting those representations in the service of protest. The fourth chapter investigates autobiographical women's writing from the mid to late 19th century, a genre that I call the rural sketch. Intervening in a tradition inaugurated by settler writers like Carolyn Kirkland and Harriet Bishop in the United States and Susanna Moodie and Catherine Parr Traill in Canada, Native women also wrote autobiographical accounts of life on the Great Lakes. Collaborating with settler editors or other gatekeepers to create their works, Anishinaabe memoirists like Elizabeth Morrison and Elizabeth Therese Baird nevertheless insistently tie their own stories to the histories of their communities. Um, these stories take the form of the personal recollection to tell broader stories about the persistence of Indigenous people, noting particularly the increasing racialization of indigeneity across the 19th century. For Morrison and Baird, the personal becomes a mode to preserve the stories of their people in print. So my project ends in the late 19th century with an investigation of the souvenir as a way of thinking about history. I examined texts that were printed and sold as souvenirs, including Charles Fletcher Loomis's 1882 birchbark poems and Potawatomi writer Simon Pickagin's 1893 birchbark pamphlet, The Red Man's Rebuke, to argue that the souvenir becomes a potent form to explore the fate of Indigenous history in a period marked by increasing consumerism and disposability. Pickagin's pamphlet adapts this form as a way to smuggle in a radically anti-colonial historical narrative, but its birchbark pages also subvert the souvenir's penchant for trivializing history. For birchbark, with its many uses within Anishinaabe culture, from its role as a writing surface to its importance as a material for crafts sold to tourists, testifies to the endurance of native lifeways. So sort of that's a big overview of my project, but I want to shift now to thinking about two examples of material from the Clements collections that have influenced this project. The first, I think, can help us to see history as a textual practice in the 19th century. As a literary scholar, my interest is in thinking about how history was written during this period, what forms it took, and how it was printed. And when we adopt this lens, I think we can see that the development of professional norms and practices that would be recognizable to us as history um, uh, was a much more contested and uncertain process than we might have imagined. I'd like to illustrate this point by examining one work from from the Fergus Printing Company, a publisher run by Robert Fergus, a Scottish immigrant who arrived in Chicago in 1839. The Fergus Printing Company really takes off several decades later, however, when Fergus becomes interested in republishing material on the history of Chicago, particularly pamphlets, lectures, and other kinds of short form writing. So, one such work he reprints is J.N. Ballestier's lecture, The Annals of Chicago, an account of the development of the city of Chicago from its origins as a quote, Indian village to the founding of the very Lyceum that Ballastier is speaking to. So the Clements has copies of both the original 1840 printing and Fergus's reprinting in 1876. So I want to pause on the cover page of the 1876 version. And I think we can see here that there are many dates that are listed here. There's the date of the original lecture, the date of the original publication in 1840, then notice about the introduction that he's written, 35 years later, a review in the Chicago Tribune. So we hear all these layers of history that are here, of the history of the printing of it, that are here on the title page. And I think one thing this shows us is the number of institutions and individuals that made history possible in the 19th century. So, in addition to the author, the publisher, we have the Lyceum, the Chicago Tribune. They're all important players in bringing this text to public attention. But I think there's also, in this sort of cascade of dates, a kind of drama of antiquarianism here, recovery as a selling point. And there's a sort of a sense to me of an emergence of a self-conscious historical class or community in Chicago. People are interested in this history and the sort of history of its history. So Ballestier's introduction emphasizes this drama, explaining how the text was lost even to him before Fergus found it in the archives of the Wisconsin Historical Society. As Ballastier says ironically, up to the present time, therefore, I may justly rank it myself among the very rare authors of the world, and I ought perhaps to regret that I am now to be made cheap and common. Although meant as a joke, there's clearly some unease for Ballastier about his republication. What does it mean for his text to be available as a relatively inexpensive pamphlet? Implicit here as well are questions about where history belongs, what proper form it should take, questions that I think are not settled in this pamphlet. And this is borne out in the diversity of the Fergus Printing Company's other publications that I was able to look at the Clements, from Juliet Kinsey's secondhand account of the Battle of Fort Dearborn to a 600-page edition of the personal papers of Ninian Edwards, the first and only governor of the Illinois Territory. What history looks like, what makes a historical account valuable, still seems really up in the air. For my second example, I'd like to expand my geographic scope slightly to talk about Suzette LaFlèche, a journalist and writer and member of the Omaha tribe in what is now Nebraska, and her contributions to a small book entitled Umaha Tawata, Omaha City. Written and published as a souvenir for the 1898 Omaha Trans-Mississippi Exposition, the book includes the 1854 treaty with the Omaha that ceded the land that would become the city of Omaha, biographical accounts of important Omaha leaders, stories translated, the editor insists, as literally as possible, as well as photographs and drawings. The book's author is Fanny Reed Giffen, a white settler, with LaFlèche being credited only for the illustrations. Yet her role seems much greater than that. There are translations from LaFlèche and her sister in the book, and a story supposedly told by her mother. Significantly, both LaFlèche and Giffen are credited on the copyright, and you can see that on the right hand of the screen. Um, Suggesting a canniness, I think, on LaFlèche's part about credit and authorship. Whatever her role, LaFlèche seems to be using the book to comment on the celebratory ethos of the Trans-Mississippi Exposition, a World's Fair meant to showcase the development of the American West. LaFlèche asserts her family and community's place on the land that is now Omaha, insisting that the history of Omaha can only be told with Native people at its center. I think we can see LaFlèche's historiographic intervention most clearly through one of the paintings that she provided for the volume. The book reprints Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 1845 poem To the Driving Cloud, a sentimental poem that describes with sympathy but unshakable assurance the disappearance of Native people in the face of European settlement. Longfellow invents the figure of Driving Cloud, supposedly chief of the Omahas, whose incongruous appearance in the, quote, city's narrow and populous streets portends the imminent displacement of indigenous people. On the facing page is a painting by LaFlèche, identified in the front matter, though not on the page, as Driving Cloud. Unlike the, quote, gloomy and dark figure described in Longfellow's poem, LaFlèche's representation of the Omaha leader is strong and commanding. And I think we can see the face is sort of illuminated by the white feathers and the regalia. The hand is raised, his tight grip. And even I think the positioning of the figure, sort of slightly off center, as though he's sort of ready to sort of stride off of the page into the real world, suggests this sort of strength and power that is nowhere to be found in Longfellow's poem. So through her painting, LaFlèche contests narratives of decline and vanishing, but her target is especially significant, I think. LaFlèche is aware of how the history of Native people has been described and circulated through poetry just as much as it has been through prose. Longfellow, the author of the epic Hiawatha, must have seemed like an especially good target. Yet she does not attempt to displace Longfellow's poem, but works within its terms to create a representation that can challenge his ideology. Even as she represents a fictional character, La Flèche is saying something true. So I hope these examples give a sense of what the approach I offer in my project can allow us to see in archival material from the 19th century. Pamphlets can reveal the developing protocols of Western historiography, while a souvenir booklet can assert Indigenous belonging. But my aim with this project isn't simply archival. At the broadest level, what I'm trying to do is provide a prehistory of recent debates over how the Native past is remembered. Controversy over statues of Columbus and the names of institutions like the museum now called Plymouth Patuxet reflect this pressing public dispute. In response, Native historians have self-consciously written new revisionist histories, and I just have a few here. Nick Estey's Our History is the Future, Ned Blackhawk's The Rediscovery of America. So Estey's Our History is the Future, for example, is an account of what he calls the traditions of Indigenous resistance. Estey's project points towards the world-creating power that Indigenous people have always recognized to inhere in the act of telling their own histories. In tracing the genealogy of this struggle, writing history in the 19th century Great Lakes shows us the long history of Indigenous innovation in representing the Native past. All right. Thank you.
So much, Ben. And now we'll turn it over to Emily.
Wonderful. Let me share my screen quickly and we'll get started. All right. Well, thank you so much, Angela and Anne and Ben, for your fabulous presentation, and everyone else at the Clements team. My time at the Clements this past January was just wonderful. So I'm very grateful for your hospitality and for inviting me to today's Bookworm. So my project, my time at the Clements was to really support my dissertation research. So today I'm going to give you an overview of my project, and then, like Ben, I'd like to dive into a couple of examples from the collections to really highlight the sheer importance of the Clements collections to Native women's histories and how scholars can kind of get into women's lives. So, my dissertation, like Angela said, is titled If You Had Paid Attention, You Would Know Gender, Politics, and Power in the Anglo-Cherokee War. So I'm investigating Cherokee women's political thought, will, and leadership during this conflict in the mid-18th century Southeast. And I'm really arguing that this war begins, is fought, and ends on Cherokee women's terms. My first two chapters, which are the ones top of mind right now as I've sent them off to my advisor, are on the various ways that Cherokee women could and did enact their political wills and assertions of sovereignty, including alliance building, espionage, striking trade deals, and even murder. My third chapter, which I'm working on now, is on Cherokee blood law, how war sparked when four Cherokees, two men and two women, were murdered along the banks of the Little Saluda River in South Carolina. Then, as matrilineages called for retribution, a full-out war began, with alliances and enemy lines defined along Cherokee women's constructions of kinship. And finally, the dissertation ends by exploring the peacemaking process, outlining how women, through controlling prisoner exchanges and deciding when to return to towns that had been ravaged by war, decided when the war was really over. It's really impossible to overstate how much my dissertation relies on the Clements collections, especially the William Henry Littleton papers. So Littleton, South Carolina governor during the mid-18th century, essentially takes on Indian affairs for the British Southeastern colonies. So generally Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. I'm so sorry, my dogs have decided it's WWE fight night time. It's been a very fun morning for all of us. Um, the vast majority of the documents in the Littleton papers up until 1759, when he steps away from being the governor of South Carolina, relate to this collection. One moment, please. I am so sorry. Okay. So the number one question I get while I'm doing this work is, how do I find Native women in the archive? I think we've become so accustomed to thinking that Native women are invisible in these colonial archives. And to some extent, it can be really hard to find Native women's own voices in these archives. You know, Native women are generally not writing as much as men in the 18th century, and there are some examples of women being shut out of the diplomatic process with Europeans. But after spending a lot of time in the Clements collections, my answer to that question is that Native women are actually everywhere in the archive if we know where and how to look for them. So using some of the documents I consulted during my time as an Alfred A. Kay Fellow, I'd like to walk you through my research process and how I find and uplift Cherokee women that are often erased in colonial archives in the historical narrative. So this first document was a surprise to me, the most wonderful surprise that I found at the Clements. So this is a report from a Cherokee woman named Buffalo Skin from August 1st of 1759. So this report is a document enclosed from Paul Desmarais, the commanding officer of Fort Loudon at the time in the Overhills Cherokee country. And he encloses this report as he's writing to Governor Littleton. And so the context of this document is that Paul Desmarais invites this woman, the Buffalo Skin, to come speak with him because he knows that she went on this diplomatic envoy with other Cherokee people, some Muskogee Creek people, down to the French. And so the quote that I've pulled from this document comes from that first paragraph right up there, as Desmarais is giving an introduction to Littleton about who this woman is. So he says, an Indian woman called the Buffalo Skin, who formally gave Raymond Desmarais an account of the agreement between the Tellico people and the French at New Orleans, went from this about 2 months ago in company with some others on a journey to the Creek Nation, and in their way called at this new settled place called Itua, where they were joined by the Mortar and his gang and proceeded to that nation, and from thence to the French fort, and being returned, gives the following accounts. And the rest of the document is several pages of what this woman saw, her thoughts on the matter, and other details that she thinks are relevant to give to Desmarais. So this document is fascinating to me for a couple of reasons. First, the fact that this woman gave Raymond Desmarais an account of what happened between the Tellico people and the French at New Orleans. Raymond Desmarais, Paul Desmarais' brother, was in command at the same fort several years before. He gets sick. Paul Desmarais comes in the beginning of 1758 to relieve him. So this woman has clearly had long-standing diplomatic relations with the commanding officers at Fort Loudon. We can also tell that she is a very well-connected diplomat within French, Cherokee, and Creek polities as well. So she is traveling with Tahlequah people from the Overhills. She's going down to meet the French. She's clearly connected to the Mortar and his parties. The Mortar is a Creek leader from Abaca homelands. And so she is extremely well connected and travels extensively throughout the Southeast. She also has a one-on-one diplomatic relationship with the fort. Both Desmarais brothers specifically request that she come and talk with them. So they're clearly recognizing her as an essential source of information about what's happening in Cherokee country. And so from just this document alone, we can see that one possibility for Cherokee women's politics is to be a diplomat. So gathering information while traveling with different envoys, and then importantly, she decides whether to share the information with the British or not, and which details to share or not. In the rest of this document, she really focuses on what the male warriors are doing in their time with the Creek and with the French, conveniently erasing what she was actually doing with them, thus giving herself more options whether to continue this diplomatic relationship with the British and the French, and perhaps shaping how the British are thinking about some of the other men that she's traveling with. But also in this first sentence, we can see that several years ago, she had given a similar report to Raymond Demright. And so this document really inspired me to go back in the Littleton Papers and in the South Carolina Indian Book, as they call it, and cross-reference to try and find who this woman is. I was able to find her because I found the other report she gave in 1757, where similarly she discusses an envoy that she took with the Tahlequah people and the French to New Orleans, Mobile, and Fort Toulouse. So this woman becomes the focus of my first and second chapter because I was able to cross-reference her back to the original report she gave. And so finding one woman, tracing her across time and place, leads me to finding her again, as well as the other women that she works with, works against, and is even related to, because in that first report, she talks about traveling with her daughter extensively. So this was such an amazing find, and I can't wait to include this document as I continue thinking about the war itself in 1759, because how exciting is it to have several pages of a Cherokee woman's report, of course, translated and transcribed, but still a close representation of her own thoughts. Then this next document is frankly iconic in the study of Southeastern history in this mid-18th century. So this is an excerpt of a journal from the Siege of Fort Prince George. So Fort Prince George is a British fort, more southern, so it's in the lower Cherokee towns. And it is really the site of some of the major battles during the Anglo-Cherokee War. So this report is created by the officers that are besieged in this fort, specifically Alexander Milne, who's the ensign of the fort. And this is his report of his experiences and documentations during the siege. So this particular copy spans from February 9th, 1760 to February 24th, and the excerpt I've chosen is from February 14th. So essentially the problem that kind of kicks off the siege of Fort Prince George is a massacre of Cherokee hostages. They are part of an envoy that goes down to meet with Littleton in Charleston, and then on the way back, they're placed under armed guard. Then they are taken to Fort Prince George, and despite their family members' many efforts to get them out of Fort Prince George, they remain hostages and then are later killed. It's also worth noting that the officers of this fort are famous for committing sexual violence against Cherokee women. In the fort, in their own homes, it's a really brutal place to be a Cherokee woman. And so, as this document reads, in February 14th of 1760, two women approach the fort from the riverside coming from the town of Keowee. Mr. Doherty, a prominent trader, goes to the river to see if he can get any intelligence from them. When he's speaking to them, the great warrior from over the hills, otherwise known as a Conestoga, comes to the river where the women are with a bridle in his hand. The warrior gives a signal with the bridle, he swings it above his head, and then 25 to 30 native men fire upon the fort and they shoot Lieutenant Coitmore through his chest. So, what do we get from this? First, mobility, questions of mobility. We can see that even during times of war where Cherokee men are constantly besieging these British forts, Cherokee women still have the ability to walk freely through their own homelands and territories, not even accompanied necessarily by men, because these two women approach the fort alone, which suggests that Cherokee women really dictate who enters their lands and polities. Next, we have relationships to warriors. So here, the women are really essential to creating the ruse that will lead these warriors to being able to launch this attack on Fort Prince George, which clearly has some major effects. They kill the commanding officer. So these women are really essential to the intelligence in this fort and to launching this attack. So warriors are relying on women for espionage and intelligence, and similarly, British soldiers are relying on women for the same. Mr. Doherty, or Ensign Milne, and Lieutenant Coitmore expect intelligence to come from these women, suggesting that they've had that type of relationship before. And finally, this attack was likely the women's idea, or at least guided by them, because Lieutenant Coitmore is one of the men that is most often cited as sexually assaulting Cherokee women. So Akanastota kills him first, which I think raises a lot of really fascinating potential for how much of this war is inspired by violations of Cherokee women's bodies and, by extension, their sovereignty. So, a couple of my major takeaways from the collections that are really proving to be essential to the project. As we can see, Cherokee women are working out in front in the political sphere, not behind the scenes. So we can see how they're acting as diplomats, they're acting as intelligence agents. They are not simply remaining behind the scenes supporting their husbands or their other male kin, though that's certainly a very important role. But we can actually see them pursuing their own agendas and really creating these relationships with British and Cherokee men alike to really kind of launch their own political activity. And the second is an insight I never thought I would actually get in my dissertation because beginning this project, I didn't expect to see individual Cherokee women in the archive. But because of these amazing finds I've had at the Clements, I'm able to move my lens of analysis from these big nebulous groups of women or women from specific towns, and now I'm able to get really granular. So I can think about how women are defining politics for their towns, certainly, but also for their individual families and even just as individual agents working for their own agendas. Again, I never thought I would be able to have that level of analysis, and so it has been just so amazing to be able to find that and really be able to expand the women that I'm talking about and understand what individual Cherokee women were thinking and were doing during the 18th century. But of course, like Ben gestured to, these projects of Native American history go far beyond scholarly interest. And in fact, I think studying Cherokee women and Indigenous women generally has major ramifications for the political climate today. Um, it's become very clear both as an Indigenous woman and studying these amazing women from the past is that Native women have always been important, in fact, essential to our communities. Always have been, always will be, even despite a society and a government that seeks to eliminate that importance, such as this administration that just took down the 2023 report on missing and murdered Indigenous women, hamstringing our tribe's abilities to track data and increase awareness about this issue, really terrorizing our communities. And so when we study the histories of Indigenous women, we get a better understanding of what Native women's power looked like historically and how we can protect it and continue to revitalize it today. So thank you all very much.
Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted. Now can you hear me? All right, great. So yes, thank you, Emily. Thanks, Ben. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section. I am going to share my screen and do just a couple of housekeeping announcements while everyone thinks about their questions. As we mentioned, this is a fellow focus because Ben and Emily both received research fellowships at the Clements Library. And I want to make sure that everyone knows that the visiting research fellowships for the next session are currently open, and we have a wide array of wonderful offerings available due to our generous donors. And We're accepting applications until January 15th. So please spread the word. Please let people know that there's a wide variety of visiting fellowships available at the Clements Library. We have an exhibit that you can explore in person or online called For All Ages. And it's a wonderful exploration of 19th century toys and board games. If you're in the area, we have a tour today at 4 p.m. And you can check out our other dates for tours coming up in the future as well. Tickets are now available for our Adopt a Piece of History Tea on December 3rd from 4 to 7 p.m. We'd love to see you, of course, and it's really a fun program to look at materials and think about ways to help us acquire materials and conserve them, support instruction. So it's a fun program where you can adopt our historical materials and have an online book plate. So it's also a great option for, gifts for somebody who's historically minded. So you can check those out online, whether you come to the program or not. And next month, we have wanted to make sure I get the date. We have Bookworm 86, which will be an author conversation with Zara Hanslin. There we go. The Painter's Fire, a forgotten history of the artists who championed the American Revolution. So if you're new to the Bookworm, you're signed up for our monthly offerings, and you'll receive an email to remind you about next month's Bookworm. And you can choose to watch in person, or later in the day, you will receive a recording with all of the resources via email. And of course, I mentioned some of our wonderful offerings from donors. We call all of our donors Clements Library Associates, and William Clements, started this wonderful history of generosity at the Clements Library, and we invite you to consider participating as well. All righty, I see questions coming in. Oh, interesting. Let's see. So it seems like Tom is trying to think a little bit about how your presentations might intersect with each other. And his question is, to what extent did records of the century of previous French native contact influence 19th century American historical literature?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's a great question. I think that, there are obviously the Jesuit relations and a lot of writing about this 17th and 18th century French period. I think some of that is being read. I think that there is a lot of, especially, and this is speaking really broadly, I think there's a lot of anxiety earlier in the 19th century around this French past. There's a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States at that time. And so I think that there's a lot of, it's a quite contested history that I think by the later part of the century, there are ideas of regionalism, and that past and those sources become more integrated into a sort of history of America. But yeah, I think that past is quite contentious at the beginning.
I think that, and then Tom sort of has a follow-up question that might be interesting for both of you to think about. Are there differences in documented tribal recollections and histories? Are some tribes more visible than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a complex question and thinking about, what does documentation mean and how do these recollections survive and in different formats? As a literary scholar, as a person in English, I'm pretty focused on texts. And so I think, for instance, one thing that really influences of what survives is missionization and is religion, and that religion is a way that many Indigenous people sort of come to speak and write in English. So the patterns of missionization sort of affect who is writing um, in English. But yeah, I mean, I don't tend to see huge differences in communities. But it does affect, for instance, who is and Emily's presentation is making me think about gender here, and who sort of a lot of my figures are preachers or mission or are men, right, who have learned to write in English. Um, uh, to spread the gospel. And so I think that I see it as affecting it in that way. I don't really see maybe differences. I'm pretty focused tightly around the Great Lakes, so I don't necessarily see that differences in tribes.
I'd like to add on to that. So Cherokee people, we've been very lucky to be able to record essentially everything that's ever happened to us as a community, whether that's through our oral tradition, which really places a large focus on, rather than recording specific details word for word. Instead, we value bringing the community together to instill these ideas of like the correct way to live. But in the 1830s, we also created our own written language as part of our efforts to maintain our homelands and demonstrate to the federal government that if were allowed to maintain our homelands in the Southeast, we would contribute to the rising interest in educating Native tribes. And we, you know, for however you want to judge those assimilationist tactics, certainly at the time they were hotly debated, but because Sequoyah invented our syllabary, a lot of Cherokee people have been very invested in creating written histories about our own people. Part of my project is I'm using Cherokee cosmology to kind of contextualize what women are doing and how these 18th century Cherokee people are still thinking about their world. And part of that is I'm steering away from using white settler ethnographers, not least because in the community we know that a lot of our ancestors lied to them and just told them random crap that they made up to get them to go away. So instead, I'm really pulling from women like Wahna Nauhi, who was related to Sequoyah, comes from this family of Cherokee intellectuals, who writes her own bulletin to the American Department of Ethnology within the Smithsonian with a collection of our, original stories, and the story of Sequoyah is told by her family. So we have this really thriving universe of Cherokee intellectuals. And so I think that as much as Cherokee people are able to tell our own stories, not least because of our need to create the written language and begin writing these things down in our efforts to keep our homelands, there's just a lot of written work generated by Cherokee people about our own stories, about our own lives and experiences. And so I do think that certain tribes have more or less of that than others. We also happen to be a very large tribe. We are also a very well-known tribe. So people tend to seek out Cherokee perspectives on our own past. And so just wanted to throw that in there as well about the importance of the development of the syllabary and what written language can do for that.
Thank you. Thank you both. Um, Catherine has an interesting question for you, Emily. She's wondering about the art piece at the end of your presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So that piece comes from Theda Purdue's cornerstone book, Cherokee Women, Gender and Culture Change. And that is really It's a sweeping text about Cherokee women's lives, essentially from creation up until the Indian Removal Act. And it is really a cornerstone in the study of Cherokee women, and that piece of art is what's on the front cover of the book. So there's not a lot of images generated of 18th century Cherokee women. Even the 19th century artists that are creating all these images of men, they're not painting Cherokee women or they're not creating lithographs of Cherokee women. And so that painting, I think, is the best representation of Cherokee women in the 18th century that we really have. That I was searching for images the other day to put on the slides, and it was all AI and just like totally ahistorical garbage. So I like to include that image. It represents women from our seven clans and a lot of the kind of hallmarks of Cherokee women's lives: basketry, pottery, agriculture. You can also see things like the peace pipe and the white feather wing, symbols of women's power and diplomacy. So it's really, I think, a beautiful piece that represents Cherokee womanhood across time and is a useful image for anyone who's maybe not as familiar with um, just Cherokee women's aesthetics and roles in our community.
Thank you. Thanks. So Valerie has a question for Ben about state-funded history anthologies that were published in the late 19th centuries by white historical societies. Have you studied any of these documents, and do you have any thoughts regarding their interpretations and representations of Native people? She is thinking specifically about the Michigan Pioneer and historical collections.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I haven't studied specifically this the Michigan Pioneer, but I have looked at other collections like this, and I mean I think um, they're an interesting kind of mixed bag because in many ways they are really reproducing, I think, many of the most sort of stereotyped accounts of the history of Indigenous people. But you also sometimes find in these collections, and I think there is a deliberate use of these collections as a way of Indigenous people preserving their own stories sometimes. So I think about William Whipple Warren's. Um, History of the Ojibwe People, which is first published in the 1885 Minnesota Historical Collections. I think of some of Elizabeth Therese Baird's writing that appears in um, some sort of similar, I think, Michigan focused. She's from Mackinac Island writing. So I think that these can be places where you can find, again, and sort of thinking about what you can do with the archive, these can be places where you can find those kinds of stories among a lot of stuff that can be, I think is really just reproducing stereotype.
Thank you. Um, Emily, we have some lovely comments about encouragement from Stephen to keep putting these women front and center. And Marshall is thinking about how they're sort of the first women libers. And I noticed in the chat, Stephen also mentioned buffalo skin woman's name and thinking about women and labor and her name. So I don't know if you have any further comments on that.
Yeah, well, first, thank you all so much for the encouragement. I Stephen, I don't know if you're still around, but I'm reading and citing Rivers of Power extensively in the first chapter, as I'm thinking through how Creek and Cherokee women are interacting during these travels. And so I really, really do appreciate your comments. Um, yeah, I think it's always really, Marshall, to speak to your comment about women's liberation, I think, one of the first times I really encountered Cherokee women in an undergraduate setting was in my Intro to Women's and Gender Studies class. And it was this petition from 1819 that Cherokee women circulate to their men and are like, hey, like, don't sell off our lands or else you're going to have to deal with us, your mothers. And I just found that so moving. And I think that a lot of people assume that Cherokee women have to really fight for power and grasp at power when in fact they have been the power brokers the entire time. And so I think that that's just such an interesting perspective to put on, Indigenous feminisms and women's liberation and different pathways to what that might look like. And to speak to buffalo skin, so as I was traveling back to those 1757 reports, and that one, her name is Oxina'a, which is interesting. I'm going to the Cherokee language to try and figure this out. I've been kind of obsessed with names lately and trying to uh excuse me, and trying to just on a lot of different levels. I've been really obsessed with names lately. And so I've been going to the language to figure out what Oxina'a means and its potential connections to buffalo skin, but certainly I think that it would be really interesting to see, if she's joining any of these hunting parties, kind of I guess, the different avenues of power that processing deer skins or animal hides gives to Cherokee women as, they engage in these Atlantic markets that are really desperate for deer skins. And as Cherokee women, they're the ones really refining and producing that commodity. So all this to say, yes, I'm very interested in her name as well, and I will continue to take a look at that.
Thank you. Ben, Miriam is thinking about the captured by Indians accounts, and wondering, thinking about those as sources.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that the sort of captivity narrative tradition is a really early tradition in sort of white settler writing about indigenous people. Like we can think about, Rowlandson in the, when is that, 1680s or 70s. So that I think it goes really far back. And I think that tends to be, those tend to be very sensational accounts, especially by the 19th century. I mean, people have sort of tracked in thinking again about reprinting, Rowlandson gets reprinted as a kind of like adventure story. So I think those are often, um, it's seen as a sort of exciting genre. These tend, the work that the kind of writing that I've been tracking, I think is not sensationalized in that way and is interested in facts and figures um, in a different way. But I would say it's in there is, especially in these settler accounts, I think a similar ideological bent that is just expressing itself in different ways. Um, but yeah, I would say they sort of differ in that way that a lot of the writing I'm doing is trying to be a lot more sober than these captivity narratives that are quite um, have a narrative thrust and are trying to be exciting.
You. Um, So let's see. Cheryl is thinking about women's roles, and so were they low-level traders of goods and all of those kinds of things, and did that give them increased contact with settlers? And wondering, if that plays a role in their relationships.
Absolutely. So when British soldiers or traders come into the Southeast, they know that they first need to endear themselves to women because women are their entry point into Cherokee polities and into these networks of power and exchange. And so often the first thing they'll do is they will take a Cherokee wife. And um, that is often not necessarily. the marriages look a lot of different ways. Sometimes these men already have wives back in Charleston or Augusta or wherever it is that they're coming from. But Cherokee women are really their entry point into the Cherokee universe. They're also the ones making sure that these white men get fed. So Fort Prince George and Fort Loudon constantly have issues with their cornfields. They're trying to grow their own corn. It's not going very well, not least because, again, these are military men that don't really know necessarily how to manage agricultural labor. Also worth noting that there's not necessarily a lot of enslaved people or indentured servants at these forts. So it's a lot of low-level soldiers attempting to do this work themselves. And so the Desmarais brothers create contracts with local women, and essentially they're acting as um, commissaries for the British armies. And so one woman, Nancy Butler, she has a white husband, but Nancy is really the most important one out of that marriage. She travels across the overhills and essentially collects these canoe loads of corn and then brings them to the fort. And the Desmarais brothers pay her handsomely. She is extremely well regarded to the point that when when a translator and a soldier are on the run, they've deserted the fort. They write to Nancy begging her to provide for them and to keep the soldiers at the fort away from them so that they can make it to Charleston. So I think certainly that kind of connection with women providing for these soldiers and traders really increases proximity. These people know these women know these men, and um, does certainly create some professional relationships and intimate relationships. And especially given that a lot of my documents do come out of the military, that is one of the major places that women are showing up is as spies, as the people that control the logistics of the different regiments stationed at the forts themselves.
Thank you. Um, all right, let's see. So there's a couple of questions about names. So I don't know if either of you have comments on these two. So I'll read them both. Tom is wondering about Schoolcraft's efforts to improvise Native American names for New Michigan counties. Do they recognize Native peoples? And then Anne is wondering if Cherokee women were ever given geographical names. So I don't know if either of you know the answers or have comments on those.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure about this. I'm really hesitant to give Schoolcraft any credit for correctly or in good faith, um, you know, acknowledging Native people. I think there's a really great, I don't know if Maureen Conkle has done one of these bookworms, but she'd be a great person. Her recent book, What Jane Knew, is really amazing on the relationship between, she's done amazing archival work on the relationship between Schoolcraft and Jane Johnston Schoolcraft. And that, he was not acknowledging a lot of the things that her and her family were doing. So I'm loath to give him any credit.
As to Cherokee women's naming, so what I have been taught is that Cherokee people um, are all called by the word for egg until, Cherokee people did something to distinguish themselves and get their own names. Because essentially, up until we define ourselves as individuals, we are just our mother's eggs walking around outside her body, which is something I totally love and think is really cool. So, um, a lot of the women in the records I'm seeing have names like Nancy is a really common one. It becomes very confusing when she's only called Indian Nancy. It's like, well, okay, time to figure out which Nancy this is. So oftentimes they are given these English names, but generally speaking, Cherokee naming really goes towards either like your like personal characteristics. So um or towards different personality qualities that you have. So in my sources, there's an uncle and nephew pair that share the same name because the uncle is bringing up his nephew to essentially assume his role as a headman after he dies. And so they share the same name because, the uncle is trying to mold the nephew into the image of himself. And so I haven't seen any women with geographical names. I have seen places named after women though. So there's this place called the War Woman's Creek. I'm pre I'm trying to figure out who the War Woman is. I think it is the wife of one of the headmen of Chota, but I'm not entirely sure. I think so, but I'm not really prepared to state that full stop. So it's kind of more places are named after women.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you both. So Paul has a question for Ben. How do the histories of Native people that you're focusing on in your project intersect with the rise of the field of archaeology and the wave of interest in prehistories of Native people, inspired by evidence of Native presence on the landscape?
Thanks, Paul. That's a great question, and I think it's something um, I need to think about more about how it fits in. I guess the what I would say is I think that there is a big question about evidence and what counts as evidence and what are what is going to be the building blocks? Like what are we talking about when we're talking about Indigenous history? What kinds of proof are we using? And I think that the rise of archaeology and people starting to think about earthworks and other forms of indigenous sort of placemaking is sort of complicating those evidentiary standards, right? And there's a confusion around how are we going to tell these stories and what are we going to, what is going to be the building blocks of them. And I think that archaeology is only as arising as this sort of new, is sort of contesting with forms of document-based history and then oral tradition. And so I just see that as contributing towards this sort of complicated playing field in which different writers are able to sort of take advantage of that to their own ends.
Well, thank you both. It's wonderful, as Paul mentioned in his comments, to see, how your work has continued to progress since we last interacted with you at the Clements Library. And we're delighted that you're telling these stories and thinking carefully about these sources. So, and thank you everybody who signed on and asked such great questions. All right. Have a great weekend.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you all.